Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorgen, and I'm here with London Paul. And one of the things that this channel is a focus on is the events that are shaping the emerging multipolar world. And today we wanted to look at a number of different things, and they may be dry, they may not be necessarily the most entertaining, but they're important steps that are taking place in the wide world that really aren't getting a lot of look by those in the West. And it was something I mentioned to Paul earlier, is that the West is not really realizing what's going on in the emerging multipolar world. And one day they're going to wake up and it's suddenly going to be there, and they're going to have that look on their face like, what happened? Anyway, Paul, I want to thank you as always for being a part of this discussion. And perhaps we've got about 4 or 5 topics we can touch upon briefly here that have taken place over the last few weeks that are important to the emerging multipolar world.
Well, ironically, it's more like days. I mean, that's how compressed things are. At this point in time, there's a lot of developments, and they're all part of, as you say, shaping what I would call a rapidly maturing multipolar world. I mean, we're seeing developments in the last 5 years that historically would have taken 50, 100 years. That's because the world evolves and changes very quickly. So, without further ado, as they say, one of the points he wanted to make was Modi's visit to Kiev. Now, just to put a bit of context on this, Zelensky was extremely unhappy when Modi obviously met up with Putin and gave him a big hug. And this really rankled with Zelensky, as though, you're condoning Russia's behavior. And obviously, they aren't very happy that India's bought enormous amounts of Russian oil and has been trading in non-dollar terms and trying to evade sanctions, etc. Well, it is an historic visit because he's the first Indian prime minister to visit Ukraine. But basically, he came out, Modi, and went, look, I'm calling for a peaceful end to the war. He said, we have stayed away from the war with great conviction. It doesn't mean we're indifferent. He came out and went, we were not neutral from day one. We have taken a side, and we stand firmly with peace. Now, okay, they did sign some agreements. Well, that remains to be seen to what extent those agreements can ever come to fruition, because it largely depends on what happens with the nation state of Ukraine in the future. And obviously, one of the problems you have, and it might seem trivial, but it isn't, is really technically Zelensky's no longer obviously the president. And technically, according to the Ukraine constitution, Ukraine doesn't exist. The government no longer exists. So it's just stateless. So the argument is any agreements that are now reached between India and Ukraine might not be worth the paper they're written on. That's just an observation. But clearly, Modi's continued to pledge humanitarian support for Ukraine. Does that mean that humanitarian aid gets to the people? Well, that's highly debatable. But clearly, there is a humanitarian problem. No doubt about that. And but overall, the question is, and people going, well, what's Putin going to make of this? And he doesn't care. Why would he care? I mean, if Modi wants to go and visit, Modi can visit whoever he likes. It's not going to damage relations between India and Russia in any way, shape, or form. This is part of multipolarity. It's like you can have allies, you can work with people and nations we may not agree with, but that's not our problem. Can we work together for mutual benefit and win-win cooperation? Yes, we can. So what's the problem? There's no doubt about that. So the other question is, was Zelensky expecting Modi to castigate the Russians? And there is no doubt conversations were had about the support that India has given to Russia by buying energy. And the Indian foreign minister made the point, and okay, people say maybe he was just splitting hairs or being a bit flippant when he said, this is nothing to do with Russia. We need energy. We buy energy. We need, as though, well, some people go, well, that's just, you're making excuses. And arguably you could, to some degree, sort of levy that argument. But at the end of the day, there was no way that India is going to turn its back on Russia, or Russia turns its back on India because of it. So the question is, what really is Modi trying to achieve? And for me, he wants to become more of an international statesman. He wants India to be regarded as a major player on the world stage. This is also for PR purposes back home, because even though he's recently elected, in polls, for what they're worth, his support is waning. So it could be as much for benefit to try and take some benefit domestically, but as much as anything also benefit internationally. And he could be seen as one of the people who helps to bring the war to an end and reach a peaceful resolution. And India has certainly tried to contribute in that way. I mean, without any shadow of a doubt. And, but there was no way. India's had very warm ties historically with Russia for decades, even during the Soviet Union time. So it's just that's not going to make a scrap of difference
I see it,
to the relationship.
I see it as I'm sorry.
No, go on, carry on.
I was going to say, I see exactly what you point. This is a microcosm of what the multipolar world is really all about. It's about the fact that it's just because you're a part of a coalition, whether it's the SCO, whether it's the ASEAN, whether it's the Eurasian Economic Union, it doesn't matter. China is going to be having trade with the United States, with India, with whomever, even countries outside of the Eastern multipolar world, long after the unipolar world goes away. So, just because you have trade doesn't mean you have military, political, or other alliances. And on the flip side, it can mean that you have those military, political alliances. But it's a respect for the sovereign governments and the way that they choose to rule over their own people. And it's only in international commerce, trade, and agreements that the multipolar world functions.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other point worth making with regards to any of the substance that came out of Modi's visit to Ukraine, obviously, in bilateral sense, there was a commitment to enhance trade and investments and collaboration, and there are existing bilateral institutional mechanisms to do that. And India's said they'll undertake some community development projects under government grants to be provided by India, of course. I mean, and the argument is, well, in the future, when the war's over at some point, I mean, Ukraine's going to have to be massively reconstructed. So there's opportunities for Indian businesses. And no doubt every country on the planet will see this as most countries on the planet will see this as an opportunity to obviously be part of that redevelopment program. But it's one thing saying all this, because none of these things are going to happen until the war's over. And at the moment, we're nowhere near any agreement ever being reached with regards to ending the war. And Russia's made its point that after Kursk, there is no negotiation. And anyway, Zelensky's not really the president and you don't have a government, so who are we going to negotiate with? And technically that's correct. So I wouldn't necessarily read too much into this. I mean, it is just an opportunity for Modi to be statesmanlike, to also say, well, we're interested in redeveloping your country and making some promises that won't deliver an awful lot, because the argument is, well, we can't at this point because there's a war going on. Yes, we're happy to provide some investment, but it's small amounts. It's nothing of any substance. But and it's not going to antagonize anyone. I mean, the West is desperate to believe that Russia would jettison India, which is just not the case. And it's wishful thinking, but also ignorance of how relationships now are developing in the multipolar world, but also how, in the case of India and Russia, it's a very mature relationship, I would say, that goes back to the times of the Soviet Union. So it's something worth discussing because it's a recent development, but I wouldn't place too much stall on anything that particularly happened there. And of course, Modi wants to rightly be seen as a leader like the Chinese, who doesn't take sides, who is prepared to work with everyone in a mutually beneficial way, and also appreciates the fact that countries like the Russians and the Chinese are not going to have a problem. I mean, China's said it will help with reconstruction. China has offered to provide humanitarian aid to Ukraine. I mean, and Russia has no problem with that. So, this is adults in an adult world, and we need to start to expect this is how it should be in the future. And it's about time in the 21st century that countries can work together, even if they arguably have other allies who could be adversaries of one of their allies. I mean, this is okay, that a war is an exceptional situation. This isn't commonplace, but this is welcome to the world of the future and the present, of course.
Absolutely. Now, for this next piece of news we're going to talk about, I want to go and lay out a little historical here. It was 1969, and the Cold War was still going on, and the Middle East found themselves in the middle of that Cold War. And it was a group of Middle Eastern Arab nations that decided to get together and form a cartel that would be known as OPEC. That was the last time a large number of Arab countries, Middle Eastern countries, got together in agreement for anything. Fast forward now, and we have MBS now planning to visit Iran. Iran and Saudi Arabia, because of their religious choices, perspectives, had been not necessarily dire enemies, but they had been in opposition for multiple decades. And now that that is breaking apart, MBS coming to Iran to meet the Ayatollah is also bringing together other Arab nations. And you see this suddenly becoming what it was almost in 1969, where there is common ground to build up themselves separate from what's in the past had been under more powerful, I don't want to say superpowers, but hegemonies. And I wanted to get your thoughts on this visit.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll come back to the point. Several years ago, I said on my own podcast, you will see rapprochement between the Saudis and the Iranians, and people didn't believe it, but it's happened. It's a very mature relationship. This is the icing on the cake of that rapprochement. It's not the beginning, it's the end of one aspect of rapprochement. And this is obviously causing immense consternation for the Israelis and the Americans, because the US thought that it'd be very easy to get the Saudis on side and have rapprochement with the Israelis, and that's failed to materialize because they want the nation state of Palestine to exist, the two-state solution with 67 borders. But in terms of MBS visiting, it's highly symbolic of this rapprochement that's now matured very rapidly. And also it's interesting today, I think it's the Prime Minister of Qatar had a meeting with the Foreign Minister of Iran. So it's not just Saudi Arabia, it's many countries in West Asia who are rebuilding relations with the Saudis, opening embassies, etc., and bringing them in from the cold. I mean, and there's a lot of reasons why Iran's been in the cold, and that's as much as anything because the Middle East were vassal states of the United States, and the US has been trying to destroy Iran for over 40 years, as we know. but times are changing. This is part of this big, huge development of the multipolar world. And one of them is clearly that Iran will be a major partner and arguably one of the biggest nations in the future in West Asia. Okay, this is a huge problem for the United States and Israel. Well, they're just going to have to get used to it. And because Iran has enormous energy reserves, it has enormous gold reserves. It's a country that's very poorly understood in the West. I'm not saying it's a perfect nation, far from it, but it is poorly understood as to the nature of the country itself. It has, for example, a very highly educated nation. So this is just another example of how the entire West Asia is moving out of the unipolar camp and abandoning it and saying it's over. We're not interested in this anymore. We're not here to be ordered and told what to do by you, the United States, or by Israel by extension. And therefore, you can expect to see more of this reproach. And we've talked about Syria before and being brought back into the Arab League. And obviously, again, the reproach between them and countries in West Asia. It's just another example of the realization where the problem lies. Is yes, there are some fundamental problems and issues that need addressing, but again, we have far more in common, and we can work together, and eventually we'll resolve the differences. And that's why it's something nobody talks about except probably us and maybe a couple of other people. But this is a hugely important development, and particularly meeting the Ayatollah. That's as important as it gets in, and symbolically it sends a huge message to the entire region. And that's why we just wanted to make reference to it today.
Exactly. And it was that last point that stuck out to me. It's not just meeting the prime minister or the president of Iran, it's meeting the Ayatollah. The Ayatollah represents the religious leader.
Well, he's the supreme commander, so to speak.
Right.
He is the most important figure in Iran. He dwarfs presidents, prime ministers, foreign ministers. So that's why it's hugely important.
Absolutely. Moving on to another interesting thing. Now, the nation of Turkey, obviously Erdogan is his own bird in many ways, but when Turkey is dealt with from the unipolar side and from the multipolar side, usually the United States will use the stick while Russia in many ways uses the carrot, offering them consolidation and cooperation, while the United States tries to browbeat Turkey. And of course, Turkey is a NATO country. But there's some interesting things going on between Russia and Turkey in Syria. Wanted to go ahead and get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, first off, recall, I think the first podcast we did was talking about Turkey. And so we're not going to rehash that. You can go back and listen to that for more background on Turkey, who has very little foot in unipolar world now, and far more in the multipolar world. And we know there's, just to briefly mention, rapprochement between Turkey and Syria. And because Turkey has certainly played a role in, at one time, wanting to be, along with the United States, removing Assad. And of course, now that relationship between Turkey and Syria is completely different. But what's interesting, and I spoke about this and has been a development on my own podcasts, with respect to Turkey's cooperation with the Russians and, of course, Syria. And that's that they've been having recently, the Russians and Turkey, joint patrols in Syria. Now, this, as much as anything, is to try and deal with this ongoing problem, because the United States is illegally in northeast Syria. It shouldn't be there. They have no justification. All this spurious nonsense about trying to protect Syria from Islamic jihadists, etc., is just a smokescreen, because the United States has been arming, financing, and training these so-called militants for over a decade in Syria and, of course, elsewhere. But the fact that Turkey and Russia are doing this is to send a clear signal to the United States that it's over. We are going, the peace is going to be restored. We're going to deal with the thorny problems of the Americans in northeast Syria. Eventually, they'll be forced out like they were out of Afghanistan. Yes, there's the issue of Idlib in the north, which is a huge problem. But I think by virtue of this cooperation, and if then you get Syria into the equation, it's the last part of the major problem of ridding Syria, because whilst they clearly did, winning the war is not exactly correct, because there was huge Russian support as well. But the war hasn't been won. It's still, there's these things that are just an ongoing problem that needs to be addressed. Most of Syria is perfectly fine now and in control of the Assad government. But there are still these flashpoints. They need to be dealt with. And this is part of the process. And I think you can expect to see a lot more cooperation between the Russians and Turkey in Syria. And just to put this in context, Turkey is obviously a member of NATO, but Turkey wants to join the SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, wants to join BRICS. But the fact that apparently NATO is really at war with Russia in a proxy sense in Ukraine, and you have a NATO ally, i.e. Turkey, cooperating with Russia, because Russia has a presence there, because they're there at the invitation of the Syrians. They're legally there. Technically, Turkey isn't either, because it wasn't invited to be there. But if they're cooperating and working with the Russians, then Syria will not have a problem. So again, it's one of those very small, apparently insignificant things, but it's hugely important. And it's all part of understanding the puzzle of what is the multipolar world, because having been talking about this for over a decade and having done thousands of podcasts about it and done interviews in the past, you know, a lot of people still think the multipolar world is about BRICS. BRICS is one very, very small aspect to this amongst countless other equally and in some respects more important developments. And whilst you're not going to repeat everything I've done in my own podcasts, because people pay for that service, but there are from time to time, and where it's appropriate, we're going to introduce some of the concepts, some of the things that have gone on in the past and will go on in the future, because as much as anything, we want to help people have a better understanding of what multipolarity really means.
Absolutely. And speaking of that, there are a couple, one maybe more, what's the term I'm thinking of? Just for, it may be just a gesture rather than an actual, but there are a couple of countries that have applied to join the BRICS recently. The first one being Azerbaijan, and the second one, interestingly enough, is Palestine.
Well, it is significant because, I mean, there's obviously a lot of historical context between the problems between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan's far more in the Russian camp. Armenia kind of was traditionally, but the West has been trying to hive it off and get it into the European Union. It would love to see the United States to have Armenia in NATO. And there's been the ongoing feud between the two countries, and they've resolved some of the problems, but there's still tensions, and the risk is it could spill out into another war in inverted commas. But the fact Putin recently visited Azerbaijan, and there's been clearly large developments going to happen bilaterally. But I think it's very clear Azerbaijan wants to join BRICS. It sees there is great advantage to doing so. And I think, you know, there's going to be strong support from the Russians to do that. And it is important because ultimately, and BRICS is not the be and end all, that it's a significant part of the multipolar world. And yes, there's the BRICS summit in October in Kazan. There's a lot of expectation that something major could come out of this. That is a possibility. It's not a certainty. And that may relate, of course, to more to do with a payment system that will be utilized that could be analogous to SWIFT. I mean, that's the Russians already have Mir, which is SWIFT. In a Russian SWIFT, you've got the Chinese SWIFT, SIPs, etc., and there are plenty of other countries utilizing payment systems. But when you have something that's unified and then BRICS grows in the future, it'd be extremely significant. And it would obviously be in non-dollar terms. But the fact that you have a growing group of nations who want to join BRICS, there's like 29, 30 more countries who want to join. Okay, there's going to have to be a process of how that comes to fruition. Yeah, Palestine was because they've been invited by the Russians to attend the summit in October in Kazan, and then the army is they're now going to submit a formal application to join, which obviously, you know, there's all this contention as to the nation state of Palestine. Well, as far as the multipolar world's concerned, Palestine exists, it will exist in the future. And that's as much a very damning political statement that the Russians have made to the Israelis as much as anything. I mean, Russia and Israel's relationship is very tenuous now in light of what's happened in Gaza. And that's very detrimental, particularly to the Israelis, because the Russians had a complicated relationship, but now they're going out their way to be fiercely critical of Israel. And that's a bit of a side issue to discussing Azerbaijan joining BRICS and Palestine. But again, there is strong reasons why Azerbaijan being part of BRICS, being part of multipolarity, part of the North-South corridor, given its geographical location. And then there's a lot of energy projects and other developments between Azerbaijan and Russia. So it makes logical sense for them to develop that relationship and for Azerbaijan to become part of this broader sort of BRICS family, so to speak. So it's an ongoing development. When they officially join and how they officially join, in what capacity, remains to be seen. But they are significant developments, and it's another example of more countries aligning themselves with multipolarity as opposed to unipolarity.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, take into consideration, there was a UN resolution declaring Palestine a legitimate country. And we know that some of the greater states in the West either abstained from it, they decided not to veto it, but they abstained from it, not giving support. And yet the multipolar world is looking to, you know, it's just, they've always been I don't want to say friends, but they've recognized Palestine. You take a look at every map leading up to the 40s and 50s. Palestine is a legitimate nation, sovereign entity, etc., whether you go back to the Ottoman Empire or not. So Palestine, once, you know, things finally get to settle down and they can establish some sort of sovereignty again, then I think that absolutely it's going to be strong ties to West Asia as well as the multipolar world. And it will be interesting to see how the global community, i.e. the UN, fits this in, or if we're going to start seeing some of these institutions fall by the wayside and become sort of meaningless as the multipolar world, the BRICS, the SCO, etc., gain in global power over, you know, decisions that are made, especially for at least one half of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Just another point I wanted to make about Azerbaijan, Ken, because to put some context why strategically it's quite important. It's on the Caspian Sea. It shares obviously a border with Iran and Russia, as well as Armenia and obviously Georgia as well. So it's very conveniently located to be a very important partner in that part of the world. It shares a border with Turkey as well. So for energy pipelines, for being a transit route between Iran and Russia, you know, extremely significant and important. So it's no surprise that it's in Russia's interest, it's in Iran's interest for them to become integrated into BRICS and part of the North-South corridor and the enormous developments that are going on in the Caspian Sea, where there's plans to put an energy pipeline between Iran and Russia, which Russia will pay for in totality. So you can see why there's a logical conclusion for Azerbaijan to be part of that process. And I'm not going to go into all the detail about Azerbaijan. If you want to, you can certainly find out that information elsewhere, and you can obviously understand what Putin's recent meeting and when he went to Azerbaijan and why that's taken place.
Absolutely. Okay, the last thing we're going to take a look at is a piece of news that came out, I think it was on Saturday. But it appears that the Shanghai Futures Exchange now is going to expand into having contracts for industrial metals, zinc, nickel, etc. Now, obviously that's important because both China in their production and manufacturing needs a lot of these, but the significance of having a futures exchange that is not under Western control means that a lot of global mining operations could end up sending their production, their metals, to China in even greater amounts and less into Western markets for them to go ahead and use.
Yeah, this is hugely important. It seems trivial, but it's massive. And it's massive because commodities is an important part of the future. There's energy security, food security, commodities. And multipolar world's attitude is we want commodities priced, not based in a dollar system, not based in the West. So we want alternatives. So we have like the Shanghai Gold Exchange as one example. But China has been certainly involved in providing commodities exchanges in the past, but it keeps adding to that roster of commodities, as you say, things like nickel, tin, etc. And the reason is it offers alternatives. So countries can then trade the commodities, the industrial metals they might want to sell, for example, in this case, but through China. So, and it can be priced on China. So contracts can be drawn up in these Chinese markets, and it offers alternatives and also offers the alternative to operate outside the Western pricing system. So, and it's a logical conclusion that this can integrate then into BRICS in the future. And because, to what extent BRICS, and there's a lot of speculation, and it is speculation, nothing's been decided as yet in the future, but is there going to be a currency? What is that? Is that currency involve baskets of commodities? So there's a logical conclusion why China is doing this, and it is extremely important. It seems dry. It doesn't seem particularly interesting perspective or an interesting development, but it's hugely significant and hugely important because, again, it's another example of China in this case, but the multipolar world being in a position where it can price commodities in non-dollar terms, create its own markets, and they can be extremely liquid. And it's a viable alternative that multipolar world countries would want to adopt. Now, how that factors in the future, is it going to be done in multilateral formats or bilateral format? How it works remains to be seen, but it is a huge step of repricing and redrawing up commodities markets globally, because after all, the global south should have a say in this, because collectively they have vast amounts of resources as opposed to the West, which in a lot of cases has very little. So they should be in a position to be able to price things how they want to price it and have contracts drawn up. And, and it won't just be the Chinese who will do this. There are other countries in the future. And, but obviously China wants to become a major commodities trading house in of itself. And that's no secret. They've been doing it to varying degrees. I think I first spoke about it 4 or 5 years ago in a podcast in some detail. And this is just part of that ongoing development, but it's highly important and highly significant. And for most people who don't understand what's happening in the multipolar world, it will pass them by and they won't regard it as being important at all. Well, I can assure you it most certainly is.
Absolutely. So anyway, that is our multipolar world update. Obviously, it is more informative than it is entertaining, but these are the type of things that when you wake up tomorrow morning, and I mean that metaphorically, tomorrow morning, the world is going to have changed, and these are the things that are the preparations and the foundations and the building blocks to that change. Anyway, Paul, I want to thank you as always for being a part of this great discussion.
Yes, and likewise, and thank you for joining me.
And absolutely, and to everyone here, I want to thank you for being a part of this community. Help us grow this channel. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.